Hello and welcome to Since Attlee and Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party, and Lee's husband. In each midweek episode, we'll be marvelling at glorious pearls of contemporary British political interest. And we'll jump right into it this week with a discussion to begin with about an article that appeared in The Spectator called De Gaulle or Nothing by Ben Judah. This is an article about what some people are now calling Anglo-Gaullism, a quite fashionable revival of Charles de Gaulle, the President of France, among some in British government and the wider intelligentsia, if I might call them that. And in this piece, Ben Judah makes his best case for Anglo-Gaullism, informed by his recent experience as working as a special advisor for the previous Foreign Secretary, David Lammy. So here, I think, is my sketch of his argument. He says, in effect, that Britain today is suffering a malaise that is similar to the French Fourth Republic in the middle of the 20th century. This was a period of time in French politics where government was marked by instability. In just 12 years, there were 22 governments. This was thanks in large part to the fact that France's parliament was elected by a proportional representation system, a fact which I think Ben Judah does not give enough attention to. He remarks that power in France was quite fragmented, that there was a lack of national self-confidence, and that vested interests were capturing different parts of the French state and making it impossible to drive the country forward. However, thanks to a foreign policy emergency, the crisis in Algeria, a new constitutional and political order was formed in France, de Gaulle's Fifth Republic, which is marked by a system of strong national leadership, national pride, big infrastructure projects, and attacks on vested interests. And so, telling that story, then Ben Judah argues that, of course, although Britain has differences in the details, it basically needs the same thing. Okay, I think there are bits of it we can unpack there, but that's the start of his story. What are the policy reforms that Ben Judah proposes? Well, in this piece, he calls for a Whitehall ministry for the British Prime Minister, the introduction of the alternative vote, the electoral system which was rejected by the British public in a referendum in 2011, and rejoining the EU's customs union, but with none of the political influence that we had while being a member of the EU. I don't mean to be unkind, but I think this is an almost laughably underwhelming set of policy proposals. And I think that part of the problem for that is that the story that's being told is somewhat incoherent and is unreflective of the particular constitutional arrangements that we already have in Britain. I'm all for learning from other countries, but the policy transformation that Ben Judah wants to see, I think, can and in fact historically has been delivered through the British Constitution far more easily than the French Constitution, whether that's the Constitution of the Fourth Republic or the Fifth Republic. Because actually, the British Prime Minister constitutionally is far more powerful than the President of France. And the President of France, even de Gaulle, had far more limitations on his power as president than Keir Starmer has under the British Constitution. Under the British Constitution, there are virtually no decisive veto points in constitution making, except for a House of Commons majority. We don't have a strong upper chamber like the French Senate. We don't have a executive who sits above the government, i.e. the President of France, who can veto legislation, because the British monarch does not veto legislation and hasn't done so since 1708. And so, actually, already, the British Prime Minister has far more freedom of action than the de Gaulle model of the French presidency. So for some of the things that Ben Judah desperately wants to see in this country, like the construction of more high-speed rail or the building of nuclear power plants, we don't need a new constitution to do this. We don't need some kind of presidential republic to deliver this. We just need governments that are willing to use the powers that are already available to them to act. Now, I think there are big problems with British statecraft, but many of those elements are not addressed in this piece. I think that in some of these areas we have quite heavily layered regulatory frameworks in which governments feel that they need to act cautiously lest they fall afoul of judicial review. And many of these regulations may, on their own individual merits, sound like good ideas and may be worth preserving, but collectively they can make big infrastructure projects quite difficult. But my argument to that is what you might want to think about then is when it comes to major national infrastructure projects, you pass primary legislation which exempts those projects from some of that regulatory thicket, or puts into legislation fast tracks that deny judicial review in certain areas in order to speed up the process of lawmaking. In other words, what I'm calling for, and what I felt Benjuda didn't address at all really, is about politics taking power from the judiciary, taking back control from a legalistic mindset, instead asserting a political mindset when it comes to policy making. My other point is that rather than look at France, although of course it is always, as I said, helpful to look at international comparisons, I think it's worth looking a little bit more closer to home, looking at our own history, because we do have a history of where the British state did do very, very big things, did set up huge social programs, did deliver major infrastructure projects, did create brand new towns in the middle of the countryside out of in a very rapid period of time in the mid-20th century. So really, although I'm not, in my own view, against the idea of giving the Prime Minister a larger ministerial department for the support of the work of the Prime Minister, that's fine. I am against changing the electoral system, especially because actually the problems of the French Fourth Republic were about proportional representation, not first past the post. And I'm certainly against limiting policy-making authority by rejoining the EU customs union, which would basically allow the EU to sell access to the British markets to third countries over which Britain would have little to no influence. But what I do think that we need is a change in the mindset of our political leadership class, a political class that is willing to work outside of what we might call the kind of civil service mindset or the member state mindset, and actually think about the reassertion of politics. What I think we need in Britain is not a de Gaulle. What I think we need in Britain is another Attlee. And so for me, rather than saying it's de Gaulle or nothing, I think for Labour, it's Attlee or nothing.
I also read this piece and also wasn't convinced by it. It starts quite early on with what I think is a staggering confession. A confession that goes to the heart, really, of why this Labour government has been so disappointing, not just to people like me who didn't vote for it, but also to people who did and people who wished it into being. Benjuda writes, "When Labour came to power, I truly believed the country had been suffering from Tory problems." And this is a hint at the idea which Lewis Goodall has recently said the same about Keir Starmer. He basically became convinced that what was wrong with Britain was that the Conservatives had been in government for 14 years. That the diagnosis wasn't really much more sophisticated than the Tories are bad and they've blundered. And so Labour didn't really come up with a compelling, radical, different programme. It basically just pitched themselves as being the better people, on what basis it's not always been entirely clear, and therefore once they got in, it would all be fine. To adopt a metaphor, it's a bit like saying the Tories have holed the ship below the waterline. When there's a new captain in charge, everything would be fine, but you don't do anything about the fact that you're holed under the waterline. In fact, if we look at some of the policies that Keir Starmer's been pursuing, it's like the cannons are still pointed at the hull of the ship. but he just expected everything to get better because there was a new captain and a new team in charge. So that lack of imagination about the challenges the country is facing in the 2020s, which we shouldn't exaggerate or shouldn't overdo, and aren't necessarily particular to Britain. There's still lots of strengths about the country. I don't want to fall into the doom and gloom trap that many people who commentate on British politics at this time do. But the idea that those problems amounted to little more than the Tories being in charge was always an appalling failure of imagination and analysis. On the substance of the article, I think one of the problems I had with it, and again, this is not unique to Judah, this is a long-standing problem, I think, in British politics. There's a temptation, and you hinted at this, to confuse the political with the structural. And this has been going on for a long time in British politics. And if you want to see the worst example of it, it's probably in the 1990s when people were talking about how devolution in Scotland would kill nationalism stone dead. Well, whether or not Scotland is a country that believes in Scottish separatism or Scottish nationalism is a subject of political debate and argument. It's not a subject strictly of the structure of British governance. And yet, people in the Labour Party who introduced devolution thought that, well, we'll create the Scottish Parliament and that's the SNP over. Whereas instead, it looked as if in May, the SNP are going to win again, possibly even a majority, and that Scotland will have had an SNP First Minister since 2007. And you hear that line of thinking time and time again from a certain sort of analyst or commentator of British politics and the British state. Here is the structural solution to a problem that we're facing: electoral reform, more devolution to other parts of the UK, whatever it may be. But actually, the questions are political and the answers are political as well. On this new fashion, this new fad for de Gaulle is an interesting and compelling person in French political history, and there's a lot to be said for Gaullism or Anglo-Gaullism, I would say. And one of the things that Judah focuses on is this idea of investing a lot in infrastructure. I think most of us would agree about the need to do that, that France has benefited from its generational investment, say, in nuclear power, and that Britain should invest in the infrastructure, energy, transport, and more that it needs. But again, that is about the political will, and you don't have to go to de Gaulle, like you say. I know you cite Attlee. Well, you could cite Macmillan. You could cite those Conservative governments of the 1950s who built the motorways in this country and who invested a lot in the future that they thought we needed at the time. Not always correctly or brilliantly. Go and look at a municipal building built in the 1950s or early 1960s, and you'll realize that that rush into futurism in the middle of the century that a lot of people believed in was gravely mistaken. But they were the equivalents in this country of what de Gaulle was doing in France. And they could be lodestars that need improving and refining, but they could be lodestars for politicians in this country. It's very tempting to focus on de Gaulle because de Gaulle, with the transition from the Fourth to the Fifth Republic, is this tremendous rupture in the life of the French state. And he then puts it on a much more stable footing and then implements these policies. But actually, the important thing is, and this is to agree with your point, that that was happening in Britain, actually, at the same time in lots of ways, with the Attlee government, with the post-war Conservative government. It feels less dramatic because it didn't come with the major constitutional upheaval. But that's because it didn't need it for the exact reasons that Richard sets out. So the problem for me is a lack of ideas in politics. We do need people to have ideas about the future and where we're going, and then a lack of political will to actually make it happen. I mean, right now we have a majority parliament, massive majority, that Keir Starmer won a landslide victory, and yet is not using it to great effect. Even with things that I wouldn't necessarily agree with, but which progressives and people on the left may think is worth doing. And that for me is the problem.
Yes, so I completely agree that what we're facing in this country, I think, is a problem of poor political leadership and an underdevelopment of policy thinking. And of course, there may be ways to boost some of that structurally. Again, maybe this office for the Prime Minister is not a bad idea. But actually, part of the problem also is about our political culture and how the parties have underinvested, for example, in policy research, The parties used to have very robust research departments that spent a lot of time thinking about policy, both in and out of government. Those have been, I think, in both Labour and the Conservatives, have been very, very substantially weakened. The parties also used to have lively culture of internal policy discussion and debate, which was shut down in Labour by Keir Starmer when he became party leader. The parties used to have significant sort of attached think tanks like the Fabian Society in Labour, which today, I don't mean to be unkind, are basically a shadow of their former selves, and I think produced fairly underwhelming policy reports, not all the time, but quite often. So there are lots of problems and lots of work that needs to be done. But I put a lot of the fault with our political class, not with our constitution. I don't think we need a new constitution, but I think that we need better political leadership. And I'm afraid, again, not to make this too personal, but I do think that Benjuda actually himself is part of the problem, because I think that he suffers from the same political cultural malaise of most of the political actors in the system that he critiques. Fundamentally, I think he has something of a member state, civil service, liberal rules-based order mindset, which limits people's range of political thinking. And just recently, there was a discussion about the British government paying reparations for the slave trade. And on that point, Benjuda made an intervention where he said that the UK, this is to quote him now, the UK needs the votes of the Caribbean in the United Nations, and we need the future economic growth that come from markets of the future like Nigeria. I think it's just sort of worth, when people make those kind of statements, just worth pausing for a moment. We need the votes of the Caribbean in the United Nations. Why? Why do we need the votes of the Caribbean nations in the United Nations? Might be a good thing to have. It might be desirable, but is it something that we need? And if we really need them, to what extent? I mean, what are we willing to lose or to trade off in order to secure that? Is that a conflation between something that is nice to have or desirable versus something that is truly an indisputable element of the British national interest? Ditto when it comes to access to the markets of growing economies like Nigeria. Are they essential? At any cost? Would reparations actually secure access to these markets in perpetuity? Would we be denied access to these markets in perpetuity if we didn't award reparations? What are the alternatives? Is this a trade-off that we're willing to have? Now, I know I'm being somewhat uncharitable because this was basically a post on X, which is by its nature going to be somewhat limited. But I thought it just gave a little window into this kind of civil service common sense that seems to be very prevalent in Whitehall. I'll give another example, not of Benjuda, but someone else I was talking to a few months ago, very smart person who worked in the Foreign Office, where at the time when Benjuda was a special advisor to the Foreign Secretary at the time, David Lammy, about the Chagos Islands. And I said, do you think this is the right thing to do, to pay Mauritius to take control of the British Indian Overseas Territories? And he said yes. And I said, why? He said, well, it buys us influence in the African Union. It helps Anglophone African Union states look more favorably to Britain than they otherwise would. And that might help us also in the competition with China in Africa. So actually giving Mauritius control of the Chagos Islands rather than handing them over to China might buy a soft power in the African Union, which helps us to compete with China in the African Union. You know, I can sort of see the logic of that argument, and I'm not saying that it's on its face wrong, but I think there are so many assumptions that are baked into that argument, so many leaps of logic that one has to undertake to get to that point that need to be interrogated quite profoundly before you get to the conclusion. And yet, for so many, I think, in our political class, and I don't want to just pick on these two individuals because I see that they are intelligent and thoughtful people. I'm not trying to be unkind to them, but I think it is symptomatic of this mindset where people who are in this world just make these huge, bold claims as if they are just the sensible, common sense thought. And when someone might say, well, actually, why don't we do something actually rather different? Why don't we do something that we haven't done in a long time? Something that maybe we used to do quite a lot and we stopped. Or maybe we should think that the rules that we've been working to for the last 30 years, 40 years, actually aren't sacrosanct and maybe haven't been working that brilliantly. That's the discussion that I think we ought to be having in this country. And actually, I feel in spite of the bold pitch of Ben Judah's argument, in its actual content, it's really rather limited.
Yeah, there's lots more we could say about that, but fundamentally, countries cannot depend upon other countries, particularly those who are neutral or agnostic or actually hostile to it, cannot depend upon their benevolence for its influence and power. And the idea that, say, underpinned the Chagos deal, which I thought was monstrous, and hopefully we've seen the back of that, well, we'll give in to the demands that are made of us. We'll somehow pay a shed load of cash in order to get back a bit of what we want from that. And then other people will respect us more. It's just insane. I really do think that is mad. There might be a logic to it, but fundamentally, I just don't think it works or can work. And if we are to take the view, as it happens, and this is something which, when you speak to people who are in that Foreign Office circle who say we're all for the Chagos deal, you say one of the things that I'm really disappointed they never really talk about. If we're to take the view that the British state should hand over tens of billions of pounds worth of cash, as in the proposal for Chagos, to another country for a somewhat benevolent, somewhat logically self-interested, but not really way. Well, actually, a big part of what I think they ought to argue for is actually for Britain to spend more money on international aid again. I think that would be a more sensible thing to do. If you basically want to get other countries to like and respect you, I don't think coughing up 35 billion quid, give or take, to Mauritius over the next century is a good way of doing that. I think investing more in, say, malarial treatments in parts of Africa that need it, or investing in the education of young girls in areas where that doesn't really happen at the moment around the world, would be a much more effective way to make the country look good and earn favour and respect and credibility than giving in to the demands of countries making spurious claims and then expecting everybody to respect you more subsequently.
One thing we haven't talked about in this discussion is Ben Judah's reflections on Britain's positioning between the United States and Europe. He's very clear in this piece that he believes that Britain should be more closely aligned with Europe than the United States. He talks about how, in the course of his time working for David Lammy, he shifted from being an Atlanticist to more of a pro-European. I wonder if he was much of a Eurosceptic beforehand, but nonetheless. And part of Gaullism for him is about taking a leadership role within the European Union. That's too big a discussion, I think, for now. But what I think that basically reflects, in my view, again, is about that limitation of the Whitehall mindset, where basically those are our only two options. We either have to be completely in hock to the United States or we have to be within the EU, when actually there's an alternative path here, again, thinking more of the Attleeist rather than the Gaullist approach, which is to say that actually what we need to do is to prioritize our own domestic industries. And if that means that we need to put up tariffs against Europe, then perhaps we need to consider that in certain industries to try to build up our own industries. I mean, one of the things that we've not been able to do in this country for 50 years since we've been in the EU is to show preference to our own national producers. And now that we're out of the EU, that is something that is now on the table again, that we can actually pursue a policy of national economic preference. When we were in the EU, that was against the law. It was seen as a distortion of the European single market, which was a fundamental violation of the terms of our membership of that organization. That's the sort of thinking that I think that we need to put on the table. Some of it might be good ideas, some of it might be bad ideas, but just thinking, well, what All we need to do is jump right back into the EU customs union, shows the paucity of some of the political ideas that are floating around, even among the reformers in our politics at the moment. Lee, what's your matter of interest this week?
Well, in the last week, we've had a flurry of articles promoting Andy Burnham and his potential takeover bid for the Labour Party and the government. And so I wanted to talk about, and this isn't to be unkind about the people who've written the articles, the journalists, but I think within the Team Burnham strategy to get him onto number 10 are some really weak, misguided assumptions about what it would take to put the mayor of Greater Manchester into Downing Street. I'll begin just by saying I happen to be a skeptic of Burnham. I think Burnham has been quite successful in terms of crafting a new image for him in recent years. But some of the reasons why I'm quite skeptical of him is that whilst I think he's quite an effective political actor, and in that sense I mean actor not in terms of the actions he gets done, but the way in which he acts out the role of mayor of Greater Manchester, he is essentially a classic career politician, Andy Burnham. After school, he went to Cambridge, he became a SPAD, he got first elected to Parliament in 2001, and he's been in frontline politics ever since. When we're talking about a potential Andy Burnham leadership bid, it would be his third bid to be leader of the Labour Party, the first one having been 16 years ago. So it's a stretch, should we say, to make Andy Burnham out as the fresh voice or the breath of fresh air in British politics. Secondly, I'm a bit of a skeptic towards him because he's often floundered at the top level of British politics. He is not remembered as a tremendous health secretary in the last Labour government and became, perhaps unfairly, but became associated with a scandal in mid-Staffordshire around healthcare. And on the two previous occasions he stood for the Labour leadership, he has polled really rather poorly. Admittedly, he came second in 2015, but that was a blow-away contest for Jeremy Corbyn in the end, and his actual vote share was really quite underwhelming. Thirdly, yes, he's had a good run of form recently in terms of how he's often crafted his message, but I think he is in one of the roles at the moment where it's almost perfect for that to be a mayor of a large city, because it's relatively low scrutiny compared to being a politician in Westminster. We don't have, as we did just even a decade or so ago, quite well-developed, sophisticated, competitive media markets and investment in political scrutiny and accountability outside of the Westminster UK model in England, certainly anyway. There are exceptions to that, particularly in Scotland. But you don't have a rich media market now in Manchester that's necessarily scrutinising them. And therefore, I think being a mayor gets less scrutiny than it ought to. It's no great coincidence that Boris Johnson's reputation was at its highest when he was mayor of London. I think he benefited from that somewhat as well. And of course, Burnham benefits, just as Johnson did, from the idea that you've always got an enemy you can run against. You've always got the national government, who, whenever things don't go your way, you've got somebody else to blame. When you're in a devolved situation, you do always have that option to basically give the government a kicking as to why something has gone wrong. So I'm a Burnham skeptic, I should say. So that's worth pointing out there. But the reason why I was really baffled by some of these pieces is that the people who really want Andy Burnham to be leader of the Labour Party and Prime Minister do not seem to have learned any lessons from the Gorton and Denton blunder. So most listeners will remember this, but towards the tail end of last year, when Andrew Gwynn resigned as an MP in Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham applied for the seat. The subcommittee of the National Executive Committee of the Labour Party voted 8-1 to block him from standing on the basis that he was already the incumbent mayor of Greater Manchester and therefore should not be able to put himself forward for it. And therefore Burnham couldn't stand. Labour lost a seat to the Greens. In fact, Labour came third in the end in Gorton and Denton. So a pretty miserable tale all round for the Labour Party. But people who are briefing for Burnham don't seem to have learned any lessons from it. The strategy to try and get him back into Parliament, which is a prerequisite for him becoming leader of the Labour Party, we should say, particularly for the benefit of international listeners. It is impossible within the rules of the Labour Party to do as Mark Carney did in Canada and take over from outside of Parliament and then get in subsequently. He needs to be in Parliament in order to fight the leadership election. And the strategy seems to be, well, will persuade an MP in a safer seat to resign, and Burnham will fight that. But they don't have an answer to what has really changed since the NEC subcommittee voted overwhelmingly to stop Burnham from standing. That means they would say yes this time. It seems to either be that, well, because the Greens won Gorton and Denton, and because Burnham polls quite well, they'll want him to be the candidate so he can win the seat again. I think nonsense. I mean, if Keir Starmer thinks that Andy Burnham is coming for his job, he will do whatever he can to stop Burnham getting into Parliament. And if that means that from his massive three-figure majority, the number is down slightly because there's another Green or Reform MP in the Commons, I don't think Keir Starmer will care. It's trivial to him in the grand scheme of trying to keep hold of the leadership. And so this idea that, well, the Labour Party needs Burnham, it's Burnham or bust, he's going to be the saviour of the party. Even if you believe that, and I don't, even if you believe that, it's all about how can he get into Parliament to even be on the starting line of the next Labour leadership election. And I think the people who are backing Burnham need to spend a lot more time thinking through that process creatively than they do briefing journalists about it happening, because there is no sense in which I can see they've got a winning strategy at the moment.
I completely agree, Lee. The reporting on this week has been very strange, rather bizarre, I think. Again, not having a go at the journalists who are reporting what's being briefed to them, but there are huge gaps in the steps that need to be taken to get Andy Burnham into number 10. So Stena Rogers wrote a piece this week called Team Burnham is Getting Organised Ahead of the May Elections. This is for the House magazine, or Politics Home as it appears online. In that article, Rogers writes, getting into the PLP nonetheless remains a challenge, of course, but his, Burnham's, allies are confident that appropriate options exist and that it will be easier to exert control over the timing of such by-elections this time. Well, that is actually the crux of the matter, because none of the other things matter. Winning the leadership election doesn't matter. Becoming Prime Minister doesn't matter if you can't get him in as an MP. And the first thing I think to say is, I agree with you, Lee. I do not see how the situation has changed in any way fundamentally between when the National Executive Committee of the Labour Party blocked Andy Burnham from standing in the Manchester Gorton by-election and now. This is a matter of essential survival for Keir Starmer. And for all of the other failings of Keir Starmer, one thing that you can say is that he's been pretty ruthless about his internal management of the Labour Party. He has defied decades of Labour Party precedent in removing the whip from Labour MPs simply for being disloyal to the party line. That's not something that's happened in the last half a century in the Labour Party. He is someone who, in advance of the general election, blocked rightfully selected candidates from being able to stand for Parliament, even though it cost Labour seats in that election to the Conservatives. He blocked incumbent Labour MPs from being able to stand again for their own seats because they happened to be on the wrong faction of the party. He threw out the previous Labour leader, in whose shadow cabinet he had loyally served for years, to gain a factional advantage. The idea that Starmer would sit idly by as his internal opponents in the party smoothed the path forward for his biggest potential internal political rival to re-enter Parliament for the sole purpose of removing Keir Starmer as Labour leader and Prime Minister, I think massively underestimates the man. I've had friends who have come back to me and said, well, Morgan McSweeney isn't there anymore. Okay, well, maybe, but is Morgan McSweeney the only reason why Keir Starmer would be desperate to stay in his post? I don't think so. Okay, so then how would it actually happen? How could they try and get around the massive Keir Starmer-sized block in their way? And so some people have said to me, well, there are National Executive Committee elections in the autumn. Well, yes and no. National Executive Committee is not a wholly elected body by the Labour membership. There is a minority of NEC members who are elected by Labour Party members, and maybe some of those people will change. But when the NEC voted to block Andy Burnham, every single member of the subcommittee, except for Lucy Powell, 8-1, voted to block him. And the idea that one set of NEC elections would transform that when Keir Starmer still has tremendous influence over other members of the NEC and who sits on various committees and who ultimately makes the decisions on the NEC, I think is wishful thinking. But let's say, for purpose of argument, that the NEC did completely transform itself this autumn. Well, then you still have the issue of someone standing aside. This article by Sienna Rogers says that MPs representing very safe seats in Manchester or Liverpool would be persuaded to stand down from their seat on the basis of a promise from Burnham that once he became Prime Minister, he would appoint them to the House of Lords. Maybe there are some people who are willing to do that. But basically what you're doing is you're asking MPs with the safest Labour seats in the country to give up their jobs, to become unemployed, in the hope that the NEC approves Burnham, which is not guaranteed, that he wins the by-election, which is not guaranteed, that he stands for leader of the Labour Party, which is actually not guaranteed, that he beats Keir Starmer or anyone else who stands for the Labour leadership, including Angela Rayner, which is not guaranteed, that he then becomes Prime Minister, and at the end of all of that, he gives them a peerage. Now, maybe there's some people who are willing to do that, but if that is the linchpin of this Burnham strategy, which it seems to be, according to this article, that all hinges on someone willing to give up their seat in this way for the prospect of this far-flung reward, which, by the way, is much worse paid than being an MP. You get, if you max out, I think, as a member of the House of Lords, you're talking maybe something like £40,000 a year rather than £90,000 a year as a member of the House of Commons. I just don't see it. I really just don't see it. And unless there's something that has clouded my perception and I'm missing, I think this is an absurd strategy.
We've been fairly negative in this podcast about certain people or certain ideas. So I want to finish by saying something a bit more positive about Andy Burnham. And it relates really to the first theme that we discussed about the importance of ideas and new and fresh ideas in politics. And Burnham, somewhat to his credit, is trying to be an advocate for a slightly different way of thinking about and framing politics. He calls it Manchesterism. And there is some work going on at the moment, which is set out in these pieces, linked to some of the think tanks on the left and the centre left of British politics, to try and think really a bit more about what that might mean in practice. To the extent that that is a useful contribution to the debate about ideas and politics, I think we should welcome it. But I do happen to think it's still really quite thin at the moment. So there are two real reasons I wanted to give for that. One of them is that Burnham has written about what he sees as being the four horsemen of Britain's decline, or Britain's malaise at the moment. And they are deindustrialisation, privatisation, austerity, and Brexit. There is within that a somewhat coherent set of arguments that a politician of the left could make. But as any good doctor will tell you, diagnosis is only part of the job. Right? The rest is the cure. And so is Burnham willing to really come up with ideas about how to reindustrialise large parts of Britain and what it might take to do so? Is he willing to stand up and make the arguments about nationalisation? And what is it that he wants to nationalise in Britain? There are bits that you could do that would be fairly popular, like going after water companies. But then there are other bits that would be much more challenging politically, I think. The point about austerity has been much discussed in terms of if you want to significantly widen the fiscal envelope within which governments are acting. Well, when you have governments that are dependent upon borrowing, you have to think much more creatively about that. Is Burnham capable and willing to do that? And then the big one of Brexit. Is he willing to reopen the Pandora's box of Britain's relationship with Europe and say something which is distinct from, say, the joining a customs union, which I think is not very robust, arguably can undermine some of the points actually about privatisation and reindustrialisation, and is also a brave political argument to make, given the voters that he would be seeking to appeal to if he was to try and be Labour leader. So there are ideas circulating around Burnham, which I think are interesting ideas, but putting the meat on the bones of that, I think, is going to be very difficult. And I think the interest in Manchesterism and the interest in Burnham is actually dependent to some degree on things which are either somewhat coincidental to the fact that he has been mayor in recent years, or actually run a little bit against the grain of some of the political ideas that he is associated with. So, for example, if you go to Manchester now, and I like Manchester a lot, I lived there for quite a while in my 20s. If you go there now, you will see a skyline that is transformed from when I first moved there in 2015. Huge skyscrapers funded with foreign direct investment, international money, there for international investors to make money by either selling them as a leasehold, which comes with lots of other problems, to people who want to buy them, or renting them out at enormous cost to people who wish to live in the centre of what is a very fun city to live in and be a part of. And does that on a spreadsheet represent economic growth? Of course. Yes, it does. Does that mean that when your train pulls into Piccadilly or Oxford Road, you get a sense of a city that is vibrant and active and doing well? Yes, it does. It feeds into that narrative. But in the case of Manchester, I actually wonder how much of that vibe is actually the product of international capital and a version of neoliberal economics, even when the state is rather more involved. So there was a story not too long ago about taxpayer-funded flats that had been built, which were then sold off to Chinese landlords that were going to then be rented back to people to make money for international investors. That's not Manchesterism, as Burnham would talk about it, but it is a big part of the Manchester story in recent years in practice. And we should say the bit that Burnham or his defenders would say, that he's brought into public ownership the bus network. Fine. Don't take that off him at all. And he's kept a lower cap on bus fares, and I'm sure that's popular with people. As transport is pretty salient, especially in cities, I'm sure that is all to the good for Burnham and his reputation locally. But it's the thin end of the wedge of actually having an agenda or a compelling ideological vision for where the country itself goes to. And to move from slogans and persona to a leader with an actual policy agenda. If Burnham's to do that, I think we're really at the very beginning of that journey.
Yes, look, my critique is not one of Andy Burnham's politics or him per se. I voted for Andy Burnham to become leader of the Labour Party 11 years ago in the 2015 Labour leadership contest. I would much prefer him to be leader of the Labour Party than Keir Starmer, although that's not saying much. And I think he's correct on 3 of his 4 diagnoses of the problems of British politics. I think the Brexit one he gets wrong. So this is not a critique of him. I would love to see Burnham challenge Keir Starmer. But this is actually part of my frustration with these pieces that have been coming out of the House magazine and other outlets. It seems to be that the supporters of Andy Burnham are, as one of my friends put it recently, jumping from A to Z. We're not thinking about all the letters in between. We in the party can agree that Burnham would be a more desirable leader than Keir Starmer. But at the same time, that doesn't change the reality that Keir Starmer holds the cards, ultimately, that will deprive Andy Burnham of that crucial step of becoming an MP and therefore being able to challenge him, unless something changes that I cannot see and has not been, I think, properly aired in any of the reporting on this so far, except, I think, some fanciful thinking about changing the composition of a minority of members on the NEC this autumn.
Well, that's all for this midweek Matters of Interest. If you enjoy listening to the podcast, of course, we'd be thrilled if you left us a positive review wherever you get your podcasts from. And just a reminder that there's a link to the Patreon in the show notes, which is a great way in which you can share comments in the members chat, support the Since Attlee Churchill podcast, and also hear bonus episodes too. We'll be back on Sunday with our next look at a topic in post-war British political history. We'll see you then.
Thanks very much.